Hello, everyone. Today we're going to step into a place where the air feels heavy, like it's holding its breath, and the walls seem to be listening. It's morning, but the sun hasn't broken through the clouds. The courthouse looms ahead, tall, gray, and silent, its steps slick from an early drizzle that left faint streaks of water across the stone. People hurry past me, their coats brushing against mine, some clutching files so thick they look like they could break in half. Others move slower, dragging their feet as though they know that inside, time will stretch and bend in ways that feel unnatural. I stand still for a moment at the bottom of those steps. The cold seeps through the soles of my shoes. My breath comes out in a pale mist. I'm holding a single leather folder. Inside it, there are pieces of paper I've read so many times that I could recite every word. Pages that, to me, are more than evidence. They are my truth, the very foundation of why I'm here. I believe in justice. I always have. It's the reason I've spent weeks preparing, nights rehearsing every possible question I might be asked, and days convincing myself that if you're honest, you'll be heard. That the law, for all its complexity and coldness, will side with the truth. But today, there's a crack in that belief. I don't know why. Maybe it's the look on the security guard's face as he opens the door for me without meeting my eyes. Maybe it's the way the fluorescent lights inside flicker for just a second before staying steady. Maybe it's because deep down, I know that even the strongest walls can be hollow. The courtroom smells faintly of paper and coffee that's been sitting too long in a pot. Wooden benches line both sides of the aisle, their polished surfaces reflecting the overhead light in narrow strips. At the front, the judge's bench stands higher than everything else, casting a shadow that makes the room feel like a stage where one person decides the ending before the actors even begin their lines. I take a seat at my table. My attorney is already there, adjusting his glasses, flipping through documents with a practiced rhythm. He looks up briefly, offers a nod meant to reassure me, and goes back to his notes. I try to mirror his calm, but my hands won't stop fidgeting with the edge of my folder. Across the aisle, the other side sits with a quiet confidence that I can feel from here. Their lawyer leans in, whispering something that makes them smirk. They're dressed sharply, their files stacked neatly like trophies. I tell myself it's just theater, that the truth is still the truth no matter how it's dressed. But the way they carry themselves makes me feel like they've already been told the ending. The bailiff's voice breaks through my thoughts, deep and steady, calling the court to order. We all rise. The judge enters. Her expression is unreadable, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on the case file in front of her. My heart pounds in my ears. Somewhere inside me, there's still that stubborn hope that this is just the beginning of a fair fight, that the truth will cut through the noise. But standing here, in this cold room where words are weighed like currency, I feel the first whisper of doubt. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I'd love to know how far this story travels, because this isn't just my story. It's a story about what happens when you believe in the system with your whole heart, and what it feels like when that system starts to close its doors on you. The first blow didn't come like a hammer. It came like a whisper. It was supposed to be a routine motion, one my attorney assured me was simply a formality. We'd file, the judge would review, and it would be accepted without question. It was just a step in the process, a tiny stone on the long road toward proving my case. But when the judge's eyes lifted from the papers that morning, there was something in her expression that I couldn't read. Not cold exactly, not dismissive, just closed, as though she'd already made up her mind before the hearing even began. We'll be denying this motion, she said, her voice flat, her hands already moving the file aside. No explanation beyond a vague reference to insufficient grounds, no opportunity to speak, no moment to clarify what those grounds might be. It was over in seconds. I sat there, blinking, not entirely sure I'd heard correctly. My attorney leaned over, his pen still in his hand. "Don't worry," he whispered, though the slight tightening of his jaw told me otherwise. We'll adjust. Adjust? Adjust to what? We'd lost a piece of evidence before it even had the chance to be seen. The other side's lawyer didn't hide their satisfaction. I caught the faintest curl of a smile as they organized their neatly bound folders. It wasn't gloating exactly. No, it was worse. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knows the floor just tilted in their favor. After court recessed, I walked out into the hallway, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint metallic tang of the security scanners. People bustled around me, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. My attorney spoke quickly, already outlining Plan B, but the words barely landed. All I could think was, how do you fight a war when the rules can change in an instant, and no one has to explain why? We had prepared for attacks from the other side. We had rehearsed counter-arguments, mapped out strategy, even practiced responses for hypothetical twists. But this was different. This wasn't the enemy taking a swing. This was the referee stepping in and moving the goalposts while the game was still on. And if it could happen once, it could happen again. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the folder open in front of me. The pages inside still looked solid, still felt like truth beneath my fingertips. Yet in that courtroom, truth hadn't mattered. Not in that moment. One decision had erased weeks of preparation and closed off an entire path forward. I told myself it was just a small setback, a single closed door in a building full of others. But the seed of unease had been planted. Because if something that clear, that factual, could be dismissed so easily, what would happen when we brought forward the more complicated parts of the case? When I finally crawled into bed, I didn't sleep right away. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, and realized something I didn't want to admit, not even to myself. The fight ahead wasn't going to be about the truth. It was going to be about who could hold the ground longest when the floor kept shifting under their feet, and I was starting to suspect the other side had been playing on this uneven ground a lot longer than I had. The next hearing was where I learned that words could be sharpened into weapons. It started with the other side's opening statement. I had expected exaggerations. Every case has them. But this was different. This was a story they had crafted so carefully, so persuasively, that even I could almost believe it, and I was the one living the truth. They didn't just present facts, they painted scenes. They described me in tones so measured, so reasonable, that the venom almost slipped past unnoticed. They turned my caution into paranoia. My persistence became obsession. My refusal to back down was framed as an inability to move on for the good of all involved. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it. Calm, polished. Every word landing like a subtle nudge toward a conclusion they never stated outright, but everyone in the room could feel. When my attorney stood to respond, I wanted him to match their precision, to cut through their fabrications with the blade of truth. But in that moment, truth felt heavy, clumsy. We had the facts, yes, but facts weren't dancing the way their story was. Ours sounded defensive. I glanced at the judge. She was leaning back slightly, her face neutral, but her pen moved across the page in small, deliberate strokes. I wondered what she was writing. I wondered which version of the truth she was starting to believe. By the time we reached the witness testimonies, the other side had already laid their groundwork. Each question they asked was like a thread being pulled from the same fabric, weaving a consistent picture, one that left little room for doubt, even if it wasn't the real story. Then it was my turn to be questioned. I'd practiced for this. I knew not to let emotion take over, to answer directly, to avoid adding unnecessary details. But they didn't attack head-on. They chipped away sideways. They asked about my tone in an email from months ago. They brought up events unrelated to the case, but framed them in ways that made me seem unpredictable. And then came the pause. The kind where everyone waits, expecting you to defend yourself, to fill the silence. It's a trap, my attorney had warned me. Say too much, and you open new doors for them to twist. Say too little, and you look evasive. I answered with as much steadiness as I could manage, but I could feel the weight of their narrative settling over the room. I knew the truth hadn't changed, but I could see how easily someone could be led to think otherwise. After court adjourned, I stepped outside into the brittle cold. The wind was sharp against my face, and the city moved on around me, oblivious to the fact that inside those walls, my life was being reframed one sentence at a time. It hit me then. Justice wasn't just about presenting facts. It was about controlling the story those facts lived in. And if you lost control of that story, the truth could be buried under something that simply sounded better. That day, I started to understand. I wasn't just in a legal battle. I was in a war for the right to tell my own story before someone else claimed it for good. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single day when my friends and allies stood up, turned their backs, and walked away. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, threads pulled here and there until the fabric of my support began to fray. At first, they were still there. A few texts of encouragement before a hearing, a quick phone call after a long day in court, promises to catch up soon that I believed because I wanted to. But as the weeks passed, the tone shifted. Messages took longer to arrive, and when they did, they were shorter, lighter, avoiding the heaviness of my situation. One person, a close friend I'd known for years, stopped answering calls altogether. I told myself they must be busy, dealing with their own life. But then I heard from someone else that they'd been invited to a dinner, one hosted by someone connected to the other side. It's amazing how silence can speak louder than words. The worst part was the ones who didn't vanish outright, but changed in subtler ways. Their eyes would flicker when I mentioned the case, as though calculating whether agreeing with me might cost them something. Conversations would drift away from my fight, landing on safer topics, weather, sports, weekend plans, and when I pressed, there would be that careful phrase, "You know I'm rooting for you, but I just don't want to get involved." It's a sentence that sounds kind, but feels like a locked door. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal cross-examination, I stepped outside and spotted someone I used to lean on during tough times. They were standing on the courthouse steps, talking to a member of the opposing legal team, laughing, not polite, awkward laughter, the kind that belongs between people who share something. I froze where I stood, the cold biting at my hands, and watched until they noticed me. They waved. Just a small, casual gesture. No guilt, no hesitation. Then they turned back to their conversation, as if I'd never been part of theirs. That evening, I sat in my living room with the curtains half drawn, staring at the patterns of light spilling in from the street lamps. I'd always thought the fight for justice was about the law, the rules, the evidence, the judgment. But it was becoming clear that it was also about endurance. Not just enduring the legal blows, but the quiet betrayals. The people who slowly ease themselves out of your orbit because standing next to you has become too risky. It's hard to measure the weight of that kind of loss. When someone leaves abruptly, the pain is sharp, like a cut. But when they drift away, it's slower, more suffocating. You keep reaching out, hoping they'll grab your hand, and all you feel is air. By the end of that week, my circle had grown smaller. Not gone completely, but quieter. The few who stayed were holding on tighter, but I could see the worry in their eyes, the calculation of how long they could bear the strain. And that's when I realized something I didn't want to admit. The other side wasn't just winning in court. They were winning outside of it too. Because the more alone you are, the easier it is for their version of the story to take root. The trial wasn't over, but a different kind of battle had already begun. And in that fight, I was starting to feel like I was losing ground before I'd even had the chance to defend it.
It was the kind of move you could feel before you fully understood it. A week after the last hearing, I woke up to a notification on my phone, a news alert. My case, the one I'd been living and breathing for months, was suddenly front-page material on a local news site. The headline was short, sharp, and unmistakably tilted in their favor. The article itself didn't say anything new. It repeated fragments from public records, added a few quotes from sources close to the matter, and threaded in enough speculation to shape the story without outright lying. But the tone, that was deliberate. Every line made it seem as though I was clinging to a hopeless cause, wasting time, wasting resources. It didn't have to call me guilty. It just had to make me look foolish. I scrolled through the comments. I shouldn't have, but I did. Strangers, people who knew nothing beyond that article, had already decided I was wrong. They picked apart my appearance in the court photos, criticized my attitude, made guesses about my motives. The other side hadn't just won a moment in court, they'd claimed the public stage. By the afternoon, the ripple effect had started. My phone buzzed with polite, cautious messages from people I knew. Saw the article, hope you're holding up. A neighbor avoided eye contact as we passed in the hallway. At the grocery store, someone I'd known casually for years suddenly seemed to remember they had somewhere else to be. The opposition's lawyer was quoted again in another piece 2 days later. Calm, polished, almost sympathetic, emphasizing how unfortunate it was that things had reached this point, and how they hoped for a resolution that was best for everyone. It sounded reasonable, balanced, even kind, and that was the most dangerous part. The truth didn't matter if they owned the narrative. One morning, I caught sight of them in the courthouse lobby surrounded by a small group of reporters. The cameras were angled just right, the microphones perfectly placed. Every answer they gave was a performance, and they knew their lines by heart. Watching them, I understood that this wasn't just a legal case, it was theater, and they were winning the audience. Inside the courtroom, nothing about my situation had changed yet. But outside? Outside, they'd already tilted the ground. Public opinion wasn't an accessory, it was a weapon. One that could make witnesses hesitant, make potential allies vanish, make the judge feel the quiet pull of perception. That night, sitting at my kitchen table, I stared at the stack of legal papers in front of me. They looked the same as they always had, dense, clinical, stripped of emotion. But now I understood that each page wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a potential scene in a story, and the other side was writing theirs faster, louder, better. In that moment, I felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't just fear, it was the awareness that the fight ahead would be on two fronts. One, inside those walls, where rules pretended to be clear, and one outside, where there were no rules at all. And if I didn't find a way to play their game, I'd lose both battles, no matter how strong my truth was.
The blow came quietly, slipped into the middle of a hearing that I thought would be straightforward. We had been waiting for weeks to present a key piece of evidence, something that didn't just support my case, but, in my mind, cemented it. It was the kind of proof you cling to when the rest of the fight feels like quicksand. My attorney had told me we'd be able to submit it without issue. It was relevant. It was real. It was ours. And then the judge said, almost offhandedly, "This will be excluded." The words seemed to hang in the air before they sank in. Excluded, not considered, as if it never existed. The reason was wrapped in legal phrasing, procedural grounds, improper filing timeline. But the impact was simple. One of my strongest weapons was gone. I sat there, staring at the neat stack of documents on our table, suddenly worthless in the eyes of the court. It was like showing up to a battle with a shield, only to have someone declare it inadmissible and take it from your hands before the first strike. My attorney leaned toward me. "We'll adapt," he murmured, the same words he'd said weeks earlier, but I could see the strain in his eyes. We were losing tools faster than we could find replacements. The other side didn't hide their satisfaction. Their lawyer didn't smirk, not outright, but there was a certain looseness in their shoulders, the relaxed posture of someone who knew the scales had tipped again. I caught a glance exchanged between them and their client, a flicker of quiet triumph that no one else seemed to notice. In the hallway after the session, I pressed my back against the cold marble wall, letting the chatter of other cases pass me by. I could feel the fight getting harder, not because I didn't have the truth, but because the truth was being boxed in, piece by piece. Evidence wasn't just about what you had. It was about what you were allowed to show. And in that room, permission was everything. That night, I pulled out the now useless file and laid it on my desk at home. I read it again, line by line, as though sheer attention could change its fate. It still told the story. It still held the weight of proof. But it didn't matter anymore, not here, not in this system. The truth might live on the page, but if no one was allowed to hear it, it was nothing more than ink. I thought about all the hours I'd spent preparing it, the money that went into collecting it, the hope I'd placed on it like a fragile crown. And then I thought about the other side, walking out of court, lighter, freer, because one more obstacle had been cleared from their path. The realization settled over me like a cold fog. This wasn't a fair contest. It wasn't about who was right. It was about who could control the field, who could quietly remove pieces from the board until their opponent was too bare to fight back. And if I wasn't careful, I was going to run out of pieces entirely. By the time the winter light began to thin in the afternoons, I could feel the cracks forming, not just in the case, but in me. It was subtle at first. I'd wake up with a dull ache in my shoulders, the kind you get from holding tension too long. My mornings started later, not because I wanted more sleep, but because I couldn't summon the energy to move quickly. Coffee no longer jolted me awake. It just kept me from sinking deeper into the fog. The financial strain was a constant hum in the background. Every bill from my attorney was another reminder that justice had a price tag, and it was climbing higher with each passing week. I'd stopped buying little things, books, flowers, a treat from the bakery down the street, because even those felt like indulgences I couldn't justify anymore. My life had been reduced to court dates, legal documents, and trying to keep my head above water. And yet, I kept telling myself to push forward. That stubborn thread of belief still ran through me, though it was fraying at the edges. The worst part was the exhaustion I couldn't admit to anyone. On the outside, I still answered questions with calm assurance. I still told the few friends who checked in, "I'm fine, just taking it day by day." But inside, I could feel the weight pressing down harder, the kind of pressure that doesn't just make you tired, it changes the shape of who you are. Some nights, I'd catch myself staring out the window for too long, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. I'd think about who I used to be before this case began. Someone who laughed more easily, who didn't measure the cost of every conversation, who didn't live with the sense that at any moment, another blow might land. And then there were the dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but strange, looping scenes where I'd be running through endless hallways, doors slamming shut before I could reach them. I'd wake with my heart pounding, the image of another locked door still vivid in my mind. Even in court, I could feel the fatigue showing. I'd catch my reflection in the glossy wood of the table, eyes slightly sunken, shoulders slouched. I forced myself to sit straighter, to keep my expression steady, because I knew they were watching. Weakness was something they'd use if they could. One afternoon, after yet another long day that yielded no progress, my attorney suggested we take a break from certain filings to conserve resources. He said it casually, like a practical choice, but I heard the subtext: we can't keep going at this pace without running out of steam and money. That night, sitting alone in my kitchen, with the light off and only the refrigerator humming, I faced a quiet truth I'd been avoiding. This fight was not just about evidence, or strategy, or even the judge's rulings. It was about whether I could outlast the slow erosion of everything I depended on: my savings, my energy, my sense of self. And though I wasn't ready to say it out loud, I knew I was closer to breaking than I'd ever been before. The first time the fight spilled into my personal life, it felt almost accidental. The second time, I knew it wasn't. It started with an email, not from the court, not from my attorney, but from my employer. A polite request to clarify certain matters that had been brought to their attention. The wording was vague, almost cautious, but the implication was there. Someone had been talking. When I asked, off the record, where the concerns came from, a colleague lowered their voice and said they'd overheard my name in a conversation between a manager and someone from outside the company. They didn't want to get involved. They didn't say more, but the look in their eyes told me enough. The second blow came faster. My phone buzzed one evening with a message from a distant relative. "Saw some things online. Are you okay?" I didn't know what they meant until I checked. A post had been circulating in a local community group, anonymous, of course, questioning my stability and hinting that my case was the result of personal grudges. It didn't outright name me, but it didn't have to. The details were precise enough that anyone who knew me would connect the dots. The next day, a friend called to warn me that someone had approached them at a cafe, asking loaded questions about me, how I handled money, how I treated people, whether I'd ever overreacted to small problems. My friend told them nothing, but the fact that the questions were being asked at all was a warning. It was deliberate, a smear campaign. I'd known from the start that the other side was willing to twist the truth in court. What I hadn't realized was how far they were willing to go outside of it. By spreading doubt in my personal circles, they weren't just tarnishing my reputation, they were isolating me further. Every rumor was another invisible wall, making it harder for me to lean on anyone for support. It worked. People stopped asking questions, not because they believed the rumors, but because they didn't want to be seen standing too close. Invitations slowed to a trickle. The casual check-ins from neighbors and coworkers faded. I'd walk into a room and feel a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the way people looked at me. One night, after a long day in court, I stopped by the grocery store. I was reaching for a loaf of bread when I caught a whispered exchange between two women down the aisle. I didn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. They glanced at me, then quickly away, and their faces carried that mixture of curiosity and judgment that I'd begun to recognize all too well. I left without buying anything. That evening, sitting in the dim light of my living room, I realized that the line between my legal battle and my personal life had been erased. The case wasn't something I could leave at the courthouse anymore. It followed me home, seeped into my relationships, even into the way strangers looked at me. And somewhere, I imagined them, the other side, counting on exactly this. Not just to hurt me, but to weaken me. Because when you start defending yourself in every corner of your life, you have less energy left for the fight that matters most. By the time we reached the middle stretch of the case, my options felt like they were shrinking by the day. Each hearing left me with fewer tools, fewer allies, and fewer ways to strike back. That was when my attorney brought up the idea of a strategic escalation. His voice was careful, measured, as though even saying it too loudly might invite bad luck. It wasn't a simple move. It would mean submitting a formal request for a specific kind of evidence from the other side, something that, if it existed, could expose a gap in their story. It was a long shot, one that could backfire if the judge saw it as desperate or vindictive. But if it worked, it could shift the balance, even if only for a moment. I went home that night and stared at the ceiling, weighing the risks. Every instinct told me that the other side was holding something back, that behind their perfect confidence was a detail they didn't want exposed. And yet, I also knew that going after it could be dangerous. If we failed, they'd spin it as proof that I was grasping at straws. The next morning, I gave my attorney the go-ahead. "Do it," I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were trembling. Filing the request was like dropping a stone into still water. The ripples came almost immediately. Their lawyer's tone sharpened. The next hearing had a tension to it that wasn't there before. They objected, of course, with rehearsed outrage, calling it invasive, unnecessary, even unethical. But for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in their expression when they turned back toward their client. It wasn't fear, exactly, but it was close enough to keep me going. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and deadlines. Every response from them was designed to stall, to bury us in procedural tangles. But each delay made me more certain we'd hit a nerve. Then came the counterstrike. Out of nowhere, they filed a motion of their own, one that sought to have parts of my testimony ruled irrelevant. The timing was no coincidence. It was their way of saying, "If you push, we'll push harder." I knew it was a gamble from the start, and there were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd made a mistake. but there was also a strange sense of clarity in the risk. For weeks, I'd been reacting, defending, absorbing their blows. This time, I'd made a move that forced them to look over their shoulder. Still, the pressure mounted. I could feel it in the clipped tone of my attorney's emails, in the way the judge's gaze lingered a little longer during hearings. This wasn't just a legal maneuver anymore, it was a test of endurance. And deep down, I understood the truth. If this gamble failed, it wouldn't just cost me leverage. It might cost me the last shred of momentum I had left. It happened without warning. No whispered heads up, no subtle hint in the air. One morning, my attorney walked into our meeting with a file in his hand and a look I'd never seen before. Not panic, not exactly defeat, something heavier. "We need to talk," he said, sliding the file toward me. Inside were copies of emails, long, detailed exchanges between someone I trusted completely and the other side's legal team. They weren't just friendly check-ins. They were strategy discussions, updates, small pieces of information, shared casually, but enough to give the other side insight into our next steps. The name at the top of those emails made my stomach drop. It wasn't just an acquaintance. It was someone who had sat next to me in planning meetings, someone who'd nodded along when I rehearsed testimony, someone who, months ago, had told me they believed in me no matter what. And they hadn't just drifted away. They'd chosen a side, quietly, deliberately, and it wasn't mine. When I asked my attorney how long this had been going on, he sighed and rubbed his temples. Long enough to do damage. I couldn't process it all at once. My mind jumped to every conversation we'd had, every moment I'd let my guard down, wondering which of my words had ended up in the wrong hands. It was like trying to track a leak in a sinking boat. You don't know where it started, only that the water's already waist deep. The betrayal cut deeper than any legal loss so far. Evidence could be fought over. Rulings could be appealed. But trust, once broken, it doesn't come back the same. In court, I saw them, sitting behind the opposing table, not close enough to be part of the official team, but close enough to watch. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, just kept their eyes forward as though we were strangers. It made sense now, the moments that hadn't added up, the sudden change in how the other side responded to certain arguments, the way they seemed to anticipate our moves before we made them. I'd thought it was luck or skill on their part. Now I knew better. That afternoon, I sat alone in my car, parked in the shadow of the courthouse. Papers lay scattered across the passenger seat, but I couldn't bring myself to touch them. All I could see in my mind was the quiet ease with which someone I trusted had stepped over the invisible line and left me exposed. This wasn't just about losing ground in the case anymore. It was about realizing how quickly someone could rewrite the map entirely, handing the other side the advantage, while I was still playing by rules that no longer mattered. And the worst part? They'd done it so silently that I didn't even know I'd been losing until it was already too late.
The verdict came on a gray afternoon that felt heavier than the others, as if the air itself knew what was about to happen. We sat in the courtroom, the wood-paneled walls absorbing every sound until even the shuffle of papers felt loud. The judge's expression was unreadable, her gaze moving between the file in front of her and the two tables before her bench. My hands rested flat on the table, but my palms were damp, my fingers rigid. She began speaking, her tone steady and deliberate. Each word spaced far enough apart that I had time to hear it, and dread the next one. I caught fragments, phrases about insufficient burden of proof, lack of admissible evidence, and favorable consideration toward the opposing party. The sentences didn't need to be heard in full. I could feel their weight pressing down long before they were finished. Then the final line landed, quiet but absolute. The judgment was in their favor. It didn't crash over me like I'd expected. It was slower, like water seeping in through every crack at once, chilling me from the inside out. I didn't move. I didn't speak. My attorney's voice was somewhere in the distance, saying something about possible appeals, but the words barely registered. Across the aisle, the other side sat straighter. There were no visible celebrations, no overt gloating, just the subtle air of people who had expected this outcome all along. They didn't need to cheer. The silence said enough. I kept my eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table in front of me. My reflection stared back, faint and warped, like a version of myself I didn't quite recognize anymore. When the session ended, I stood and gathered my things with slow, deliberate movements, as if I could somehow delay the moment I had to leave that room. Stepping out into the hallway, the noise of the world felt wrong. Too loud, too busy, as though life outside had been moving at its usual pace while mine had just been dismantled. I thought about all the hours, all the resources, all the pieces of myself I'd poured into this fight. I'd believed the truth had a natural weight, that it would tip the scales if I just held on long enough. But the scales hadn't tipped. Not for me. And the worst part wasn't losing what I'd been trying to protect. It was knowing that the people who had twisted the truth, cut corners, and played the shadows had walked away with everything they wanted. The bad side hadn't just won. They'd done it cleanly in the eyes of the law. As I stepped out into the cold air, I realized the fight was over, at least here. The system I'd trusted had closed its doors, and I was standing outside with nothing but the echo of its final words in my ears.
The courthouse was behind me, but its shadow followed me home. The first evening after the verdict, my apartment felt smaller, like the walls had moved in just a little closer while I was gone. The familiar objects, the lamp by the window, the clock ticking softly in the corner, looked unchanged, but they no longer felt like they belonged to the same life I'd been living before. I dropped my bag on the chair and stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do first. There was no next hearing to prepare for, no stack of questions to practice answering, no documents to comb through one last time. The fight was over, and the sudden emptiness of that truth was heavier than I'd expected. The phone sat silent on the table. In the past weeks, I'd grown used to its constant buzz. Messages from my attorney, updates from the court, the occasional check-in from a friend who still dared to stay close. Now there was nothing. The silence felt like the sound of people moving on without me. I walked into the bedroom and saw the half-packed boxes I'd left untouched for months, waiting to be filled when things settled. They seemed to be waiting still, but the meaning had shifted. They weren't for a fresh start anymore. They were a reminder that I might have to leave without choosing when or where to go. In the kitchen, unopened mail sat in a neat pile. Bills, notices, a couple of envelopes with handwriting I recognized, but didn't feel ready to open. Even kindness felt like it required energy I didn't have. I thought about calling someone, just to talk, to hear a voice, but the thought stalled halfway. What would I even say? I lost. The bad side won. And now, I don't know what's next. It sounded too bare, too final. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from the courtroom like scenes from a movie I couldn't stop watching. I'd hear my own voice answering questions, see the judge's expression as she read the ruling, feel again the sharp quiet after the verdict was spoken. Some mornings, I'd wake up with the brief illusion that it was all still ahead of me, that I still had a chance to argue, to fight, to change the ending. But reality would settle back in like a cold weight, and the day would begin under the same gray that had hung over the courthouse steps. There's a strange kind of grief that comes from losing something you never physically held. I couldn't point to a single object and say, "This is what they took," but I felt the absence everywhere, in my plans, in my sense of safety, in the quiet knowledge that the truth hadn't been enough. And in that absence, I began to see the slow, patient work of rebuilding. Not the case, not the facts, but myself. The thought was small, barely formed, but it was there. Even if the world had decided against me, I still had to decide who I would be in the aftermath. It's strange how, after everything falls apart, the world keeps moving as though nothing happened. Buses still ran on their usual routes. Neighbors still took out the trash. The same corner cafe brewed coffee every morning. The same barista greeting customers with the same practiced smile. And yet, for me, everything had shifted. It wasn't just the verdict that had changed things. It was the way it stripped away the illusion I'd been holding on to for so long. For most of my life, I believed in justice the way some people believe in gravity, as a constant, invisible force that would always be there. The system, I thought, might be slow or imperfect, but at its core, it was fair. The truth, I believed, was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you. Now I knew better. Justice, I realized, was not blind. It wasn't even neutral. It tilted, quietly, sometimes invisibly, toward those with deeper pockets, better connections, or the right kind of charm. Truth wasn't a guarantee, it was a bargaining chip. And fairness was more a matter of perception than reality. Looking back, I could see how each moment in court had been shaped by more than evidence: the judge's mood, the lawyer's skill with words, the subtle influence of public opinion. Even the layout of the room seemed designed to remind you of your place, somewhere below the bench, looking up, hoping to be heard. It wasn't that I'd expected perfection, but I had expected honesty, and that, I learned, was too fragile a thing to survive in a system where winning mattered more than being right. In quieter moments, I caught myself wondering if I'd been naive from the start, if I'd walked into that courthouse already disadvantaged simply because I believed the rules were the same for everyone. I thought of the other side, not just what they'd done, but how confidently they'd done it, as though they'd always known the game was theirs to win. That thought should have made me bitter, and in truth, some days it did, but it also sparked something else, a kind of clarity, because once you see that the system isn't what you thought it was, you can stop waiting for it to save you. You start looking for other ways to stand. The loss still hurt, the injustice still burned, but slowly I began to see that clinging to my old belief in an untouchable, incorruptible justice was like holding on to a bridge that had already collapsed. If I kept gripping it, I'd fall with it. So I loosened my hold, not on my principles, not on my truth, but on the idea that a courtroom was the only place they could matter. The fight had taken nearly everything from me, but it had also given me one unshakable lesson. Power often disguises itself as truth, and if you can't tell the difference, you'll never see the blow coming until it's too late. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice something I hadn't expected. Small moments where the heaviness lifted, just enough for me to breathe. It happened first when I was walking through the park on a cold morning. The ground was slick with frost, and the trees stood bare against a pale sky. For months, I'd been moving through my days like a shadow, head down, eyes on the next task, the next bill, the next reminder of what I'd lost. But that morning, I looked up. I saw the faint blush of sunlight pushing through the clouds, a promise that the day would warm, if only a little. It wasn't victory, it wasn't justice, but it was something I could still claim as mine. I started noticing more of those moments. A neighbor offering to carry my groceries, the smell of bread baking at the corner shop, a letter from an old friend who had heard about my case and decided to write, not to ask for details or offer advice, but simply to remind me that I was more than this fight. These were not grand, sweeping gestures. They were small, almost fragile, but they were steady. And after months of standing in courtrooms where my voice had been drowned out, steadiness felt like its own kind of strength. I began to change my mornings. Instead of waking to the silence of legal files waiting to be read, I'd walk, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just around the block. It was a ritual with no deadline, no agenda. Each step was mine to decide. The people who remained in my life, the ones who hadn't vanished when the case grew ugly, were few, but they were constant. We didn't talk much about the trial anymore. They didn't push me to move on or find closure. They simply showed up, and in that quiet presence, I found something I hadn't felt in months: trust that didn't need proof. I realized then that while the court had taken away my legal victory, it couldn't touch certain things. It couldn't touch the moments I carved out for myself, the people who chose to stay, the knowledge that I had told the truth even when it cost me. No, it wasn't the ending I'd wanted, The bad side had won where it counted on paper. But there were other places, smaller, less visible, where they couldn't follow. And in those spaces, I was learning a different kind of resilience. Not the loud, defiant kind you bring to a fight, but the quiet kind that lets you stand again after you've been knocked down. Because the truth is, you don't have to win to survive. Sometimes survival is the win. The day I decided to walk away from the courthouse for the last time, the sky was a soft wash of pale blue, the kind that almost looks faded at the edges. The air was still. No wind, no rush of people on the steps, just a quiet that felt heavier than silence. I didn't hurry. My steps were slow, steady, each one measured as though I were memorizing the feel of this place under my feet. For so long, I had climbed these stairs with my chest tight and my mind racing, bracing for whatever turn the day might take. Now there was no verdict waiting, no last-minute filing, no whispered strategy. There was just the end. I paused halfway down the steps and looked back. The building stood as it always had. Tall, indifferent, its windows reflecting a sky that didn't care about who had won or lost inside. It was strange, realizing how much of myself I had left within those walls, and how little of it mattered here now. The world beyond the courthouse was moving at its own pace. Cars passed. A child laughed somewhere across the street. Life was continuing, just as it always had, as though my fight had been nothing more than a ripple in a vast, unbroken current. And maybe that was the hardest lesson, that even battles that consume you entirely will fade into the background of other people's lives. I walked the rest of the way down, feeling the weight of months slowly shifting off my shoulders, not disappearing, but settling somewhere I could carry it without breaking. In the days that followed, I let my mornings be slow. I opened windows to let in the cold air, watched the way light moved across the walls. I made tea and didn't rush to finish it. I didn't check the news or scroll through old notes from the case. Some afternoons, I'd go for walks with no destination, letting my feet choose the path. When people asked how I was, I told them I was finding my way. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. The truth was softer now, harder to explain. It lived in the spaces between words, the way I was learning to be gentle with myself, the way I was choosing not to replay the courtroom in my mind every night. Some things were still hard. The loss didn't feel lighter just because time passed. There were still moments when I thought about what could have been, if the rules had been different, if the system had been kinder. But those thoughts no longer held me in place. They passed, like clouds that didn't need to be chased away to make room for sunlight. I began to understand that walking away didn't mean giving up. It meant choosing to keep something for myself, my dignity, my peace, my future, rather than leaving all of it on the cold floor of a courtroom. And so, in this quiet, I said goodbye. Not to the fight, not to the truth, but to the weight of expecting the world to hand me justice, because I can still stand without it. Thank you for reading the whole story. Hope you will support my next products.